under a low and sullen sky, where the wind carried the bitter reek of smoke and the metallic tang of blood, Sergeant William "Bill" Hanlon lay pressed into the damp, freezing earth, his body half swallowed by a ragged trench that had been abandoned hours before in a frantic retreat. The war had raged for weeks along this battered strip of farmland, and now the ground was churned into a foul paste of mud, ash, and splintered timber. At 63, Bill was older than most men left fighting on this front, a veteran of another war decades past, a man the younger soldiers half respected and half dismissed, muttering that his knees were too stiff, his back too slow, and his instincts from another century. Yet here he was, alone, his rifle clutched tight, a handful of spare rounds in his coat pocket, his breath steaming in the frigid morning air. He had been separated from his unit during the chaos of the night's assault, a rolling barrage of artillery that chewed the darkness into flame, and had stumbled into this trench just before dawn, knowing it might be his only chance to survive the armored column he could already hear grinding toward him. The sound was unmistakable, the deep, chest-thumping growl of tank engines, growing louder with every heartbeat, accompanied by the metallic clank of treads crushing frozen clumps of soil. Bill pressed himself flat, face to the mud, pulling his tattered scarf up over his head to break his outline, willing himself into the shape of a discarded coat, a mound of debris, anything but a living man. His pulse hammered in his ears as the first shadow fell over the trench's edge, the silhouette of a massive steel hull crawling into view. The tank was close enough that he could hear the faint whine of its turret motor as it swept back and forth, scanning for movement. Mud and frost crumbled from the trench walls under the weight of its passage, dusting his cheek with grit. For a moment he thought of home, of the Pennsylvania fields he'd plowed as a boy, the slow, steady churn of the tractor beneath him. That was the rhythm he clung to now, matching his breaths to the groan of the treads as the beast rolled overhead. The air was thick with the stink of exhaust, hot oil, and scorched metal, the pressure of its weight vibrating through the soil into his bones. A booted figure appeared on the tank's side, a soldier riding its flank, his eyes scanning the ground with lazy disinterest. Bill's fingers tightened on his rifle, but he didn't move, not a muscle. Seconds dragged like hours. The tank passed, followed by another, and another, their bulk blotting out the pale morning light. Between them marched a dozen enemy soldiers, rifles slung, talking in low voices in a language Bill only half understood but had heard enough to catch the rhythm of orders. They were sure no one remained behind their line. They were wrong. When the last vehicle rumbled past, the silence left behind was heavier than the noise had been. Bill stayed still for another minute, counting the slow thud of his heartbeat, until the distant engines began to fade. Then he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, and shifted just enough to raise his head above the trench's lip. The road was clear except for churned mud and the tracks the column had left behind. In the distance, through the haze, he could see them moving toward the tree line, toward what he suspected was their forward base. He'd caught glimpses of its location before the retreat, a cluster of low buildings camouflaged with netting, tucked against a frozen ridge. If he could reach it, he might find maps, radio codes, something worth the risk of slipping so far behind enemy lines. His knees ached as he pulled himself from the trench, but the pain was an old friend by now, a reminder of what he'd carried and survived. He crouched low, using the churned earth and scattered wreckage as cover, moving with the slow patience of a hunter. Every step had to be deliberate. The ground was littered with fragments of shell casings, splintered crates, and the frozen corpses of men who'd fallen hours or days before. The air was sharp with the smell of cordite and decay. Once he froze as a straggling enemy scout came back along the road, kicking at debris, but the young man's eyes slid right past the still figure crouched behind a shattered cartwheel. Bill's camouflage was nothing fancy, just mud, frost, and the stillness that comes from years of learning when not to move. By midday, the sky had darkened with the promise of snow, and he was within sight of the ridge. The enemy base was more fortified than he'd expected. Sandbagged firing positions, 2 armored cars parked in the open, and sentries posted at regular intervals. But there was also movement he could use to his advantage. Patrols leaving through the far side, supply wagons coming in from the forest road, and the constant distraction of men working to reinforce their defenses. He studied the pattern for nearly an hour, noting which posts were manned and which were lazily abandoned when the cold grew too biting. His mind worked the problem the way he once fixed a broken combine, understanding every moving part before touching a thing. He would wait until full dark, when the sentry's eyes grew heavy and the snow began to fall in earnest, to make his move. That patience was something the younger men never seemed to understand. They thought speed was courage. But Bill knew better. Sometimes survival was about being the last to move. As dusk bled into night, the first flakes began to drift down, muffling the world. He pulled his scarf tighter, adjusted the strap on his rifle, and began to crawl, inch by inch, toward the perimeter. He avoided open ground, hugging the shadows of supply crates and the deep ruts cut by the morning's vehicles. Twice, a guard's flashlight swept dangerously close, but the snow and the thick, uneven terrain made him just another lump in the landscape. By the time he reached the base's outer line, his gloves were soaked and his fingers numb, but his heartbeat was steady. There was a narrow gap between two supply stacks that led straight into the heart of the compound. He could smell food cooking somewhere inside, hear the low murmur of men speaking, the occasional bark of laughter. This close, he felt the weight of the risk settle on him. One wrong move, and he'd be a prisoner, or worse, before morning. But the thought of what he might bring back to his own side, of the lives it could save, steadied him. Bill Hanlon had been underestimated all his life, from the farm boy too scrawny to enlist in his youth, to the old man they thought too slow to keep up now. And yet, here he was, crouched in the snow at the enemy's front door, ready to step through. He tightened his grip on the rifle, scanned the shadows one last time, and slid silently into the darkness of their camp. Bill had slipped into the enemy camp with the quiet patience of a shadow, moving between stacked crates and parked vehicles, each step measured, each pause deliberate, his breath controlled so as not to cloud too visibly in the cold night air. The snow was falling thicker now, settling in his hair, clinging to his scarf, muting every sound except the occasional crunch of boots from a passing guard. He moved low, scanning for patterns, the way sentries shifted, where the lantern light didn't quite reach, the gaps between patrols. His mind was running the way it had years ago on the farm when he'd stalked foxes that preyed on the chickens, learning their habits, waiting for the moment they'd expose themselves. In the center of the camp, he could see the headquarters tent, larger than the others, a dim yellow glow leaking from its seams. Men moved in and out, some carrying maps, others returning with bundles under their arms. If intelligence was anywhere, it was in there. But between him and that tent stood a dozen men and a maze of crates, barrels, and gear. He crouched behind a truck, the engine still ticking faintly from the day's use, its hood dusted white. Through a tear in the canvas nearby he spotted something: radios, spare parts, and what looked like a folded aerial reconnaissance map spread on a crate lid. Two men were talking near it, smoking, their rifles slung carelessly. Bill's first thought was how easy it would be to take that map, but the timing wasn't right. Both were too alert for him to risk crossing open ground. Instead, he stayed put, letting the snow build around him, blending in with the tarp-covered supplies. Hours passed like this, the camp slowly winding down, the voices softening, the guards growing lazy in the cold. His fingers ached from gripping the rifle, but he knew that loosening them would break his focus. Around midnight, the men by the radios left, muttering about hot soup in the mess. Bill slipped forward, his knees protesting, sliding through the narrow gap between two stacked crates. The canvas was stiff with ice, but he lifted it enough to duck inside. The warmth of the enclosed space hit him first, then the smell of oil, paper, and damp wool. He crouched by the crate with a map, unrolling it just enough to glimpse the marks, arrows showing planned troop movements, circles around key crossroads, and a star where he guessed his own lines still held. His heart thumped, not from fear but from the knowledge that this information could turn the tide for the men still fighting miles away. He memorized the details, tracing the shapes in his mind, then carefully rolled it back as it was. Taking it now would raise an alarm. Better to keep his presence invisible until he was ready to leave. Still crouched, he turned to the radios. They were modern, far beyond what he'd used in his last war, but the principles hadn't changed. Frequencies, signal strength, the delicate balance of tuning. He knew enough to sabotage them subtly, making the damage look like wear or bad weather interference. From his pocket he pulled a small tool, a relic from his farming days, and with practiced hands loosened a coupling here, scratched a contact there. It would still work for local chatter, but any attempt to reach distant units would dissolve into static. Outside, the snow muffled a sudden shout. Bill froze, listening. Boots crunched past, too close for comfort, but the guard moved on. He finished his work quickly, slid the coupling back into place, and slipped out the way he'd come. Moving now was more dangerous. Fewer people were awake, which meant any motion drew attention. He kept to the shadows, pressing against walls, ducking behind vehicles. Near the headquarters tent, he heard voices speaking in clipped urgency. He risked a glance inside. Around a table, 3 officers stood over a spread of maps, one pointing to the ridge beyond the base, another noting something in a ledger. Bill's gaze swept the tent and landed on a metal box in the corner, its lid closed but unlatched. From the markings, it was a signal flare kit, valuable if he needed to mark his position for rescue. He filed that away. Stepping back, he nearly tripped over a bundle half buried in snow. It was a discarded jacket, enemy issue but roughly his size. An idea sparked in his mind. He could use it to blend in further, moving more freely within the camp if spotted from a distance. He pulled it on over his own, the fabric stiff with cold and smelling of smoke. From here, his route took him toward the supply dump. The pattern of guards here was slack. One leaned against a post, head bowed, the other pacing a short, lazy path. Bill timed it so he crossed between them when both were facing away, slipping inside the ring of crates. He was looking for something, anything, that could aid his escape or cripple the camp without drawing immediate notice. That's when he saw the fuel drums, stacked too high, their stenciled warnings barely visible in the dim light. A few well-placed punctures, delayed until after he was gone, could cause chaos. He didn't have explosives, but he had patience and a knife. With careful precision, he scored the metal just enough for a slow leak, one drum at the base, hidden from casual view. It would seep into the ground, spreading, and with the right spark later, the place would be a bonfire. By the time he finished, the snow was heavier, the wind keening through the gaps in the crates. He moved again toward the far end of the camp, where he'd seen the outbound patrols earlier. If he could slip through their route, he could reach the ridge and circle back toward his own lines. But as he approached, a sudden commotion near the headquarters tent drew guards inward. Orders barked, men rushing toward the center. Bill ducked low, using the distraction to get closer to the flare kit. Inside the tent, the officers were shouting now, one slamming a fist on the table. Bill didn't linger to hear why. He crossed quickly to the corner, flipped open the box, and pocketed 2 flares, red and green. They were light but precious, a lifeline if he could reach a vantage point. As he slipped back outside, the distraction seemed to end. The guards were returning to their posts. He adjusted his stolen jacket, lowered his head, and walked briskly past a pair of soldiers, mimicking their pace. Neither spared him more than a glance. Beyond the perimeter, the ground sloped toward the ridge, broken by scattered trees and deep snowdrifts. The darkness was nearly complete here, the only light the occasional flicker from the camp behind him. His legs burned with fatigue, but he pushed on, knowing that the more distance he put between himself and the base now, the better his odds when they discovered something amiss. Halfway up the ridge, he paused to listen. No pursuit yet. He crouched in the snow, pulling one flare from his pocket. If he lit it now, he'd draw attention from both friend and foe, but if his timing was right, it could be the signal his own side needed to move in. He decided to wait until dawn, when the light would reveal his position to allies without giving the enemy as much advantage. For now, he found shelter beneath a bent pine, its branches heavy with snow, and settled in to watch the camp from above. Through the curtain of flakes, he could see movement, guards shifting, vehicles being warmed. They were preparing for something. Bill's jaw tightened. The maps he'd seen suggested a push toward his side's remaining positions. If that happened before he could warn them, it could mean disaster. The first light of dawn came thin and pale, barely enough to turn the snow from black to gray, and Bill could feel the night's cold settle deep into his bones as he shifted under the pine, brushing frost from his coat and flexing his fingers to bring the blood back. He had not slept, not really, only drifted in that half-conscious state where every sound cut through the fog in his mind. The crack of branches in the wind, the distant crunch of boots, the low mutter of voices carried on the shifting air. Now the camp below was stirring in earnest, with men moving between tents, the glow of cookfires blooming and then vanishing as canvas flaps fell shut, and the faint grind of engines as vehicles rumbled to life in the cold. From his vantage point on the ridge, Bill could make out a column forming near the western perimeter, trucks being loaded with crates, soldiers clustering in loose knots before climbing aboard. This was the movement he had feared, the arrow he had seen traced on the enemy maps, the push toward his side's last stronghold in the valley beyond. If they rolled out in force before reinforcements could be summoned, the position would be overrun in hours. Bill knew the flares in his pocket could signal for help, but help was not waiting just beyond the next hill. It had to be summoned from miles away, and even then, the question was whether his comrades could arrive before the enemy struck. He tightened his grip on the green flare, the one he decided would be the signal to move, and scanned the ridgeline for any sign of his own people. Nothing but snow and trees, and the slow creep of light over the horizon. His eyes flicked back to the camp. The trucks were forming up now, their exhaust curling into the cold air, and men were clambering into the back, stamping their boots for warmth. A pair of officers moved among them, shouting orders he could not hear but could imagine, the kind of clipped, certain commands that left no doubt the plan was already in motion. Bill considered his options. Lighting the flare now might call in artillery if the range was right, but it would also pinpoint his location to every enemy eye in the valley. Staying hidden meant letting the column move out unopposed, which would doom the defenses downriver. His mind, practiced in making hard calls, settled quickly on a third option: create enough chaos inside the camp to delay the departure, buying time for the message to get through and the defenders to prepare. That meant going back down. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, his back aching as he brushed snow from the stolen jacket and tightened it around him. The wind was rising, bringing with it thicker flakes that blurred the world into shifting shades of gray and white. It was cover, and he would use it. Moving low, he retraced his steps along the ridge until he found the shallow gully that cut toward the camp. The snow was deep here, swallowing his legs to the knee, but it muffled his passage. He reached the edge of the perimeter as the camp's attention was fixed on the departing trucks, the guards more interested in stamping their feet and rubbing their hands than scanning the tree line. Slipping between two parked vehicles, he moved toward the supply dump where he had scored the fuel drums hours earlier. He found them just as he had left them, the dark stain of leaked fuel spreading in the snow, glistening faintly in the dim light. The scent was sharp now, carried on the wind, and he knew one spark would be enough to turn this part of the camp into a roaring fire. But timing mattered. Too soon, and they would abandon the trucks to fight the blaze, giving the column time to reassemble later. Too late, and the trucks would already be gone. He crouched behind the crates, watching the officers at the head of the column. The lead truck's engine roared louder, the sound carrying over the wind, and Bill knew the moment had come. He drew one of the red flares from his pocket, cracked the cap, and struck it. The flare hissed to life, bathing his hands and face in a fierce crimson glow. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Then he dropped it onto the dark, wet snow beneath the punctured drum. Flame erupted instantly, racing along the slick surface, leaping from drum to drum with greedy speed. The heat hit him almost at once, driving him back behind the crates as shouts rang out from every corner of the camp. Men ran toward the fire, some with buckets, others shouting for more water, while a few turned in panic toward the trucks. The column stalled, drivers shouting at one another, engines revving without moving. The officers' voices rose, trying to impose order, but the fire was already too large, the smoke thick and choking in the wind. Bill didn't wait to admire his work. He used the chaos to slip toward the far side of the camp, where the ridge climbed again toward the trees. He could hear the pop of smaller fuel containers igniting behind him, each one sending a sharp crack through the air, followed by a shower of sparks. As he climbed, he risked a glance back. The trucks were still in place, the column broken into knots of shouting men. He couldn't see the headquarters tent from here, but he imagined the confusion spreading there as well, orders conflicting, priorities shifting. By the time he reached the top of the ridge again, his breath was ragged and his legs trembling. He pulled the green flare from his pocket and struck it, the hiss and sudden bloom of light a signal he prayed would carry to the right eyes. Holding it high, he moved into a clearing where the wind could not choke the light with snow, and kept it aloft until the last of its fire guttered out. Then he dropped it into the snow and collapsed to one knee, scanning the valley beyond. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, faint and far off, He heard it, the low, rolling thud of distant artillery, not aimed at him, but at the road leading from the enemy camp. His chest eased, though he knew the fight was far from over. The enemy would recover, the column might still form, but now there was a chance. That was all he had come here to buy. A chance for the men holding the line to survive another day. He turned from the sound, making his way deeper into the forest, the snow swallowing his footprints almost as soon as he made them, the cold biting at his face but not slowing his pace. Somewhere ahead lay the path back to his own lines, and with it, the report of everything he had seen and done in the last 24 hours. Behind him, the fire still roared, a pillar of black smoke twisting into the morning sky like a marker of defiance. Bill didn't look back again. He didn't need to. ChatGPT